and they're serving in ministries around the world. So the AJC has had a unique record in contributing to train and equip Christian leaders to serve the global church. And it is a fact, I think, that the Melbourne School of Theology has become known globally for this ministry. It's a really unusual and unique thing for a Christian institution like the Melbourne School of Theology to be able to equip Christians to contribute in a significant and well-informed way into the world of Islam. It's a unique centre of excellence, I think, and we attract students from all over the world. That is our market, really, to reach Christian leaders from all over the world. I think we have one more slide too, or a couple more. In 2015, if we could go back one. In 2015, Dr. Richard Schumack, who unfortunately was going to be here tonight, but unfortunately unable to come because of just concerns about COVID and travel and the flare-up that's happened. He was appointed the director of the centre, and it was renamed the Arthur Jeffrey Centre. Arthur Jeffrey is a very significant Australian scholar of Islam who was a professor at Princeton University. He started off as a Methodist missionary in India and then was in Egypt, and he comes originally from Melbourne. So we decided to name this centre after him. It's a great name, I think, and he did remarkable work. And there have been further appointments last year, so at present our teaching staff includes Dr. Dennis Savelyev, who's hosting us this evening, and myself, and Dr. Bernie Power, and also Richard Schumack. One more slide. One or two. Thank you. Go back to the previous one. We have now new opportunities to reach people with what we're able to provide in terms of equipping and training. Because of the revolution that's happened in education, because of the COVID actually has accelerated it, people are increasingly open to doing subjects online, and we're following a policy now that every unit we offer will be prepared for online teaching as well. So if we offer it in class, it'll be available online as well. We're building up a catalogue of units and subjects that students can do, and they can do a degree, a master's, and also you can do a PhD by research and supervise someone through Zoom now. It's just accepted. You don't have to be here in Melbourne to do a PhD at the Melbourne School of Theology. I'm supervising a student who lives in Arizona, for example, and we meet weekly, and it's possible to do all your study remotely. So these are the units that we've been working on. There are two introductory units, Introduction to Islam and Ministry to Muslims, and then other subjects that are being developed or are already in place: Apologetics to Islam, Studies in Quranic Arabic, Ministry in Islamic Settings, Deliverance and Spiritual Warfare, Introduction to the Quran, Understanding the Hadith is the traditions about Muhammad, a study of Muslim thinkers, and we're also in the future, we'll be developing other units, one on discipling Muslim background believers. There's a unit on Muhammad that will be offered, that's offered every few years, Islam in History, Islam in Today's World. So we would love to partner with people. We want people to be enthusiastic about this vision. And if you'd like to be connected with us, we'd love to be connected with you. So you've obviously registered, so we have your details, but if you'd like to continue to hear from us, make sure that we know that you're interested. We'd like to have people praying for us and supporting the vision that we have to equip the global church to engage with the world of Islam. There are events, there's news. We'd love you to tell other people about the possibility of studying here. It doesn't have to be someone in Melbourne. It might be a friend you have in the Ukraine or in Brazil or wherever. They could easily be studying with us. And we also are really grateful for any financial support. If you would like to support the centre, we'd love to receive your support and be blessed in that, because there's lots that we can do, a lot more that we could do as well with more resources. So that's my presentation about the Arthur Jeffrey Centre. It really is a completely unique, remarkable institution in terms of what's available around the world. It's very difficult sometimes for Christians to study Islam in a context where they can have a really critical and well-informed perspective. And the Arthur Jeffrey Centre is a unique vision, a unique mission. It's such a blessing that the Melbourne School of Theology has picked this up and has developed it. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Bernie Power, who's one of our staff and has been contributing to the teaching program. Great to have you with us, Bernie. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming along tonight. Yesterday it was unsure whether this event was going to go ahead, but we found that we fitted within the government requirements, so we can have a public meeting, or I don't know what they call it. It's not a public meeting because you can only have 30 people then. Whatever we're having now. So it's good to have you with us. Just commenting on Mark's observation about us having a global reach. Just this morning I was on a TV in America. So from my home, sitting room in the western suburbs of Melbourne. So the doors are really open for us to be able to contribute in ways that never would have been possible in the past. As I go through the talk now, Brian, I can't see up there. What's up there? Is that possible? My phone number will be on the bottom of every slide. And this is for people who are watching online as well, if you're doing that in real time, and that will come to this phone, and then at the end I'll answer those questions. So if people want to put those up to me, that would be great. At any time you can do that. So that's on each slide, but you can write it down now if you want to. Right? No, still haven't seen it up there. I'll just start and let the techniques catch up with me. So the topic tonight is the challenges facing Islam. Will Islam survive or will it thrive? What's its future? Where is Islam going? For me, Islam isn't just a topic of academic research. I am an academic, but it's also very personal. I've got some skin in the game, as they say, and in my case, it's literally. 2 weeks ago, I had an operation on my face to remove some potential skin cancers, and the GP said you'll need a plastic surgeon to do this, and I had a list. And the guy that I chose was a Muslim doctor from the Middle East who trained in the Middle East. And I chose him because he's the best in our area. We, as I mentioned, live in the western suburbs of Melbourne. But he has the same surname as a famous leader of the Muslim Brotherhood who just recently died in prison while facing charges for murder and terrorism. And so I was a bit curious. I wondered, are you related to this man? But then I decided I wouldn't ask him. Sometimes it's not smart to dig too deep, particularly when you're going into an operation. Anyway, he did a great job, as I expected. It's not Tom Cruise, but then he didn't have that much to work with as he went off. And praise God, none of the samples came out with any kind of problem with it. There he is with the blade, ready to go. Just down the street from where we live is a Muslim grocer named Khalid, and he's got a little tin box on his shelf where he collects money to build more mosques here in Australia. But I never seem to have any spare change when I go shopping at his store. And next door to him is a mechanic whose name is gone blank. Have we lost everything? Did I press something wrong? There we go. Next door to him is a mechanic whose name is Sammy. And he asked me to help him get his brother here from Lebanon via some legal means. We tried, but we were unsuccessful. And then around the corner is our butcher. His name is Jihad. Jihad the butcher. How appropriate. I'll tell you a little bit more about Jihad later on. I've also found myself driving, what am I doing wrong? Am I pressing a wrong button here? Huh? Oh. This is switched on. I'll just keep talking and let him catch up. Yep. I've also found myself giving driving lessons to women from Muslim backgrounds. And there was a reason for that. They couldn't find anyone else who would be willing to give them lessons, and you'll soon discover why. I was driving along the street, actually down Burke Road with one lady, and I said to her, we have to stop at this intersection up ahead. And she said, why? And I said, because the traffic light is red. And she said, oh, is that a rule? Apparently in Saudi Arabia, traffic lights are just a form of street decoration. And another lady was she already had her driving license from another Muslim country. And I said, well, let's have a brush-up lesson. So she gets into the car and looks at the floor and she says, now there's two pedals there. One makes it go and one makes it stop. Is that right? And I said, yes, that's right. And she said, now which one is which? So before we started, I said, let's pray together. My prayer was very simple. Dear Lord, please protect us, otherwise I'll see you in a few minutes. Amen. We survived, praise God. In 1920, in the year that MBI began, Islam was in serious decline, and Samuel Zwemer, the famous American missionary who earned the title Apostle to Islam, wrote a booklet called The Disintegration of Islam. In it, he said, Islam is a dying religion, and he spoke of the utter collapse of Muslim political power in Africa, Europe, and Asia. We'll come to that later. He wasn't alone in his negative assessment, because only 15 years before, there was a conference in Mecca of Muslim scholars who met together for 14 days to investigate the causes of the decay of Islam. And they came up with 57 reasons in 14 days, including fatalism, the opposition of science, the rejection of religious liberty, neglect of education, and inactivity due to the hopelessness of the cause itself. And you get the impression here, this is a religion that's lost heart. In 1914, a leading Muslim editor in India wrote, we see that neither wealth nor education nor political power can enable the Muslims to achieve their national salvation. Where then lies the remedy? Before seeking the remedy, we must ascertain the disease. But the Muslims are not diseased, they have reached a worse stage. A diseased man still has life in him. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, who's also the general who led the Turkish troops against the Anzacs at Gallipoli, went one step further. He referred to Islam as the symbol of obscurantism, a purified corpse which poisons our lives, and the enemy of civilization and science. And in 1924, under his leadership, the Turkish government abolished the caliphate. This was the supreme religious and political authority for all Muslims across the world. It's the equivalent to abolishing the Pope for Catholics. And for the first time in 14 centuries, Islam was without a leader. Ataturk's Islamic corpse, as he described it, had now become a headless corpse. So things were getting worse. So how did it get into this position? To understand this, we have to go back 14 centuries to the 7th century or 13 centuries. According to the Muslim account of history, in about 570 AD, a man named Muhammad was born in Mecca, in what's now Saudi Arabia. At age 40, he received a call to become a prophet. And he went out onto the streets of Mecca and started preaching to people, telling them they needed to submit to Allah. This wasn't very successful. It gained him about 200 followers and resulted in persecution for the Muslims, to the extent that they had to leave town. And they moved to another place. This is 622 AD. Muhammad's now 52 years old. And here a transformation takes place in Muhammad. The peaceful and pious preacher in Mecca now becomes a political prince and a militant warlord in Medina. And this was a much more successful approach. By the time he died 10 years later, at age 62 or 63, he had over 100,000 followers. And moreover, Islam ruled over the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. And the justification for this change in Muhammad's approach was given in the Quran. When we read it, we see that there are 45 peaceful verses that encourage peace and forgiveness, but these are all cancelled out or abrogated by the 415 later verses, the Medinan verses, which call for fighting and warfare. And this was the direction that Islam was heading in. Here's a quote from Professor Bassam Tibi. He was a Muslim professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And he says, at its core, Islam is a religious mission to all humanity. Muslims are religiously obliged to disseminate the Islamic faith throughout the world. We, that is Allah, have sent you, that is Muhammad, forth to all mankind. And that's a quote from the Quran. If non-Muslims submit to conversion or subjugation, this call, which is da'wah in Arabic, can be pursued peacefully. If they do not, Muslims are obliged to wage war against them. In Islam, peace requires that non-Muslims submit to the call of Islam, either by converting or by accepting the status of a religious minority, which is a dhimmi, and paying the imposed tax jizya. And he says, world peace, the final stage of the dawah, is reached only with the conversion or submission of all mankind to Islam. This was a professor in a German university who's putting forward this. This was incidentally in the 1990s when he wrote this, and that was before 9/11, and he probably wouldn't say the same thing, at least so openly nowadays. But it's important to recognise that Islam is more than just a religion. It is a fully integrated ideology. It's got social and political and legal and economic and military and religious elements. It comes as a full package, and you can't just take one and neglect the others. And there's a theological justification for Muhammad's actions in the Quran, and for Muslims later. He told them, you are the best of peoples evolved for humanity. And so many Muslims, and they read this, and I've heard this read in mosques and said, and people coming away with a sense of superiority and entitlement because of that verse, and others like it. And they're also told it is he, that is Allah, who has sent his messenger, that is Muhammad, with guidance and the religion of truth, that is Islam, to make it superior or to prevail over all religions, even though the unbelievers hate it. It wasn't something that was going to be accepted joyfully, but rather imposed in some way. But this promise gives people a sense of destiny and an assurance of ultimate victory. And when Muhammad died in 632 AD, his successors took this very seriously. They began to invade and occupy the countries around them to establish Islamic rule in those lands. And within 20 years, they had overrun 3 times more territory than Muhammad had in his final 10 years. Within 100 years, they had occupied 2/3 of Christendom at that time. They didn't lose a major battle in this first 100 years. It wasn't until 732 at the Battle of Tours that they had a significant military defeat. But the steamroller kept on going, and by 1500, they ruled most of the world, now split into various empires, and the only holdout was Western Europe. There were attacks on that. Constantinople fell in about 1454, I'm thinking. Can't remember the exact year, but certainly around that period. And then the battle to Vienna, where they were stopped there. At this time, they held more territory than any other empire had ever held in human history. But around 1500, the balance changed. The voyages of discovery opened up the new lands to the Europeans. And you can see this was to avoid the Islamic heartlands that were based to the east in Eastern Europe. And so Westerners now became the new powers, the new world powers. And in fact, 90% of the world's Muslim population was colonised by Western countries by 1920. So quite a significant change, a turnover in a period of a couple of centuries. And these countries were often carved up and sometimes handed over to puppet governments, and hence this talk in the 1920s about the demise of Islam. Will we survive? Will we be able to recover from this? So what were Muslims supposed to do in the face of this absolute humiliation? They were told that they had the best religion, the best book, the best prophet, and now here they were subjugated by these foreigners, these kafirs. Well, some of them went down the ideological route. They saw that the Europeans had triumphed because they had better education and more modern technology. And so Muslims needed to become more educated in Western ways, not in order to become more Western, but in order for Islam to retake its place of preeminence in the world. And Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, for example, established schools and an Islamic university in India to raise the educational standards of Muslims. And in this approach, Muslims felt that they needed to gain a voice in society so they could promote Islam as a modern and reasonable religion and present it as a viable lifestyle choice. And Melbourne TV presenter Waleed Ali uses this methodology. If you read his book, People Like Us, you can see it's laid out there. But others went in the opposite direction. They felt that the reason for their poor situation was that they were too much like the Europeans, and they needed to actually become more Islamic and less like the Europeans. And for them, this was a clarion call to return to the Sharia. They needed, they thought, to implement Sharia law more stringently. An example of this is Abu Ala al-Maududi, the Pakistani scholar, who was pushing the Pakistani government to Islamize even more. And it actually happened here in Australia. In 2011, the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils, the highest body in the land, went to the Australian government, that was Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister at that time, and asked if they could allow Muslims to apply some aspects of Sharia law to their community. And the government stood their ground and refused and said there is only one law in Australia. But a third approach went down the path of violent jihad. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, and you can see the list of them there on the right-hand side, and many of these are household names now. And the seminal thinker in this was an Egyptian man called Sayyid Qutb, and the result of many jihadi groups was the result of his teaching. And his book, Milestones, is available in almost every mosque around Melbourne. It's interesting to note that each of these approaches, the three approaches that I've outlined, is obedient to the saying of Muhammad in the Hadith. He says, whoever of you sees an evil action, let him change it with his hand. And if he's not able to do it, then with his tongue. And if he's not able to do that, then with his heart. And that is the weakest of faith. That is the third one. And so we see these three methodologies of military action, that is the hand of jihad, political involvement through creeping Sharia, that is the mouth, and social activism through ideological jihad by winning the hearts. These are all seen as legitimate approaches, although some of them are better than others and some are more appropriate at different times than others. So those were the three choices that Muslims took in terms of trying to re-establish the preeminence of Islam. They were greatly helped in the 1930s by the discovery of copious supplies of easily extractable oil in the Muslim lands. And this brought great wealth to Islam. Previously, they'd been poor and underdeveloped. Now they had money. In 1973, the OPEC countries quadrupled the price of oil from, listen to it, $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel. And this brought a great problem for the developed world in the cost of their fuel. But in 1979, it rose to nearly $40 per barrel. Today it's about 65, and it's been up to 100. But this is bringing great wealth into countries which have a lot of petroleum, and Muslim countries are predominant amongst those. And then in 1979, the Iranian Revolution brought an Islamic government to power. This was not a puppet government of the West as they saw it, but a government that would stand up to the West. And they showed this by seizing the US embassy and taking American hostages. And then in 1988, the Mujahideen fighters drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. And so Islam has now showed that it has significant economic power, political power and military might, and it could stand up to and defeat the world's major superpowers, the USSR and the USA. And so worldwide, Muslims became more confident. They felt it was now back on track. And interestingly, Muslim women took on the veil in countries where they had never worn it in the past, and it was a sign of identity because it was a return to their tradition and a recognition we are Muslims, and they saw it really as a sign of liberation. But one outcome of this newfound confidence was the 9/11 terrorist attacks. They targeted US economic symbols in New York, the military at the Pentagon, and the third plane was on its way to Washington, the political capital. And then after that, suicide bombings became daily events, and they continue up to today. On average, there's 5 or 6 suicide bombings somewhere around the world. But a group called ISIS actually went beyond this. They weren't just interested in terrorism. They said, we want to seize land, and we want to establish Islamic law, and we want to reappoint a caliph to replace the one that had been lost a century beforehand. And that's exactly what they did. They didn't last long, but they did it. They got up there and they showed that they can grab land, they can put Islamic law into place, they can have an international ruler once again. But they were a failure, and many Muslims around the world were either disgusted with them or disappointed in them. And they said, these guys don't know what they're doing, we don't identify with them. And it actually highlighted rifts within the Islamic community. You see, no Muslim community is monochrome. Each of them is a mixture of different groups that are inspired by competing worldviews, and some of these worldviews are quite serious. There is what we might consider to be pure Islam. That's the traditional version that's based on the Quran and Sharia. But in every Muslim society, there is also folk Islam, which draws many of its teachings and practices from traditional religions such as animism and shamanism. And they have elements in that like the evil eye and magic rituals, fear of the jinn, and intercession through praying at the shrines of holy men. You'll find these in almost every country in the Muslim world. Contact with Western education resulted in forms of liberal Islam that were informed more by secular modernism and feminism. And if you look at their teachings, and again, you can meet these at various places around Melbourne. Fundamentalist Islam has a political or jihadist agendas, but it often draws its language and its ideas from militaristic Marxism. And they talk about the red-green alliance, where you get the green of Islam and the red of the left-wing ideologies coming together and working so that they can take power. But it'll be interesting to see if they ever do, how they deal with each other. In Iran, that actually happened. The intellectuals, the liberal intellectuals joined with the Islamic radicals to help drive out the Shah, and as soon as they did, then the radicals turned on them and imprisoned or executed them. And the fifth one is Sufi Islam. It's the mystical form of Islam, and it borrows from monism and Buddhism, a lot of its ideas. But these groups, when they look at each other, they claim that the others aren't real Muslims. And besides these ideological things, there are actually institutional differences. The different sects, so you have the Sunnis and the Shia, you have the Alawis, the Khawarij, the Ismailis, the Hanafis, Hanbalis, Malikis, Shafi'is. And there's actually a saying by Muhammad, recorded in the Hadith. He says, my community, that is my ummah, will divide into 72 or 73 sects, and each of them will enter hell except one. And when I ask Muslims about this, they'll say, we are of that one sect. The other ones aren't. But the reality is that there is an ideological battle for the soul of Islam that's going on between these competing groups. And in the future, my first prediction, they will continue to fight each other, and they will each claim that theirs is the proper version. And we have all of these groups here active in Melbourne at the moment. Another challenge facing Islam is the rise of popular critical scholarship. And I call it popular because it means it's out there in the public. This critical scholarship has been around for a long time, but people haven't talked about it. It's just been the academics would talk about that in their ivory towers. Now it's out on the internet. The secret has been released. Studies about the life of Muhammad and the Quran and the Hadith, about Islamic history, and as Mark said, some of it's actually coming out of here, out of the Arthur Jeffrey Centre. They're confronting the commonly held beliefs of everyday Muslims. They've never been questioned about these things before in an open manner. And so the beliefs that they have about the perfect character of Muhammad, the idea that there's only ever been one Arabic Quran that's never been changed, that the Hadith and the traditions are a reliable record of what Muhammad said and did, and that the history of Islam was full of harmonious and diverse communities enjoying the fruits of an enlightened and progressive Islamic civilization. Those ideas have now been challenged and put out there as untrue. And it's unsettling the faith of many Muslims, and some of them, as they're seeing this, are leaving Islam because of it. And I meet these people on a regular basis. There's also the issue of violence within Islam. Professor Samuel Huntington, in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, noted that Muslims make up about 1/5 of the world's population. That was in the 1990s. It's got bigger since then. They have been far more involved in intergroup violence than the civilization of the people of any other civilization. 2/3 to 3/4 of inter-civilization wars were between Muslims and non-Muslims. Islam's borders are bloody and so are its innards. And he said, this is the most quoted sentence from my book. And he was right. In fact, he wrote this, as I mentioned, in the 1990s. That was before 9/11. And since then, things have got a lot worse. In the first 2 decades of this century, more Muslims have been killed by other Muslims than have been killed by non-Muslims. So there's been civil wars and uprisings against the government in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, nearly 600,000 people killed there. Iraq, Afghanistan, nearly 250,000 people killed there. Yemen, 130,000 killed in this last couple of years. And besides all of these deaths, you can see the Sunni and the Shia divide, the liberals versus the radicals, and ethnic and tribal differences that are adding to this fighting that's happening within the Muslim community. But the internal and external wars are just one of the problems facing Muslim countries. There are social and economic and political challenges that are tremendous. Despite the massive public protests for change during the Arab Spring uprisings of 210 to 215, they delivered little. They got rid of a few of the dictators, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. But the overall result was not an increase in democracy or a decrease in corruption. It was simply a changing of chairs. And we had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt being repressed, but in its place, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups sprung up. So historically, Muslims have grown throughout the centuries by invading other countries and extracting financial values from these conquered peoples. And they exploited the technologies and the methodologies that they found there, but they were often slow to innovate, and over time these technologies lost their value and they lost the strategic advantage that they had. And now with fewer military capabilities and with decreasing financial opportunities, Muslim economies are struggling to survive. The future of oil, which was a significant source of income for many Muslim countries, is being threatened by proposed changes to energy generation and vehicle use due to concerns about climate change. And there's also the issue of birth rate. Muslims have higher birth rates than other communities in general, Christians and in everyone really, and that, if it continues, will result in Islam overtaking Christianity as the world's largest religion by 2070, according to demographers. But this is demographics, it's not through conversion, it's through birth rate. And so they go to face social problems. Across the Middle East, half the population is below the age of 15. A generation of now educated young people with higher expectations than their parents, because they can see it all on the internet, are now about to flood into an empty job market, and unemployment will increase. And the result has been mass migration. Since 2015, over 1.5 million refugees, mostly from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, crossed the Mediterranean into Europe, and there's a picture of some of them. We remember these massive lines that were happening. But worldwide, 70 to 80% of the world's refugees are Muslim, even though Muslims are only 25% of the world's population. And this wasn't lost on my friend Jihad the butcher. We were having a discussion one time about my overseas travels. And he said, "Where have you been to?" And I said, the last couple of years I've been to Yemen, I went to Iraq, I went to Egypt, I went to Sudan, I went to Libya. And he says, and he's got the meat cleaver in his hand, he says, "Don't go back to those countries." He said, "Otherwise," he said, "stay here in Australia." And I said, "Jihad, why is it safe to stay in Australia, but it's not safe in Muslim countries? Is it because of Islam?" He said, No, it's got nothing to do with Islam. They don't practice Islam properly there, but they do here in Australia. So I said, "Jihad, how come Islam doesn't work in Muslim countries, but it works okay here in a Christian country in Australia?" He said, "I don't know about that." And he goes back to chopping his meat. But it is a clear admission of the failures of Islam. People are seeking physical security and stability. They want good government. They want freedom of speech, equality. They want human rights. They want a good education system, jobs and income. They want healthcare, capital infrastructure, social welfare, a long life and pensions. But few, if any, Muslims can offer all of these. In fact, I can't think of one that will offer every single one of those. And most of them offer very few of them. And so Muslims are voting with their feet and they're leaving their countries in droves, and they're seeking to enter Western or other countries where these things can be found. And they're bringing Islam with them when they come. What will they find when they get to the West? Most Muslims consider the West to be Christian, and certainly there are many ideals and many beliefs that are widely held in the West that come from biblical teaching. Here's some of them. The idea of universal human rights and justice come from the biblical idea that all people are made in the image of God. The idea of guilt and responsibilities for sin comes out of the Bible's call for people to live holy and obedient lives. And the weak in society to be helped because God is a God of compassion. Since all people are intrinsically equal, every voice should be heard in a humble way. And the Bible says, be slow to speak and quick to listen. And so everyone's point of view should be respected. We're told not to judge. But all of these notions were given in the context of a people who were seeking to be obedient to God. And what happens when you actually take God out of the equation? These same ideas get distorted almost beyond recognition. So universal human rights is transformed into a hyper-individualism. That is, everyone can have their own way. Guilt for sin is applied selectively. There's an emphasis on the big historical issues of colonisation and slavery and 2 world wars with all of their horrors, nuclear war. And this means that the West has lost its moral authority. It has no right to speak anymore. The call to help the weak means that everyone has a right to equal wealth. And if everyone has a right to speak, so there's no such thing as absolute truth, only personal opinions and subjective experience. And since every point of view must be respected, there is no right or wrong. The only real sin is intolerance of other people's points of view. And you can see in these statements some elements of postmodernism and critical race theory. So this is where the West is heading. So how can Muslims and how do Muslims exploit these three arguments? The first one is the historical argument. They'll say, because of what they have done, the West and therefore Christians are colonisers and they're oppressors. Muslims are the victims of Western foreign policy, and so they deserve special consideration and even compensation for that. The second one is the diversity argument, or the multiculturalism argument. It says the West is uniform and hegemonic, that is, it dominates all other cultures. Muslims as minorities, like indigenous people here, and they will bring diversity and richness to the culture, and that is good, and so they need special treatment in order to facilitate this. And the third one is the moral argument. The West has lost its moral compass, it's got no values, and it will need a religion like Islam to bring the West back to proper morality. And any questioning or criticism of Islam will be branded as hate speech and as racism and will not be tolerated. And so that's again another direction that we're seeing happening. And some Muslims have seen this, and they believe that the goal of world domination, which they were promised in the Quran, is in sight. And it's going to start in the wealthy and the bloated and the totally naive West, and then it will move back into the Muslim heartlands because they can practice proper Islam here in Australia, but not there. So my predictions, what's going to happen? My personal belief is that Islam will continue to exist over the coming decades if the Lord tarries. It will grow in numbers and as a percentage for a time, but soon the demographics will catch up with it, and its growth rate will slow, as we're already seeing in many Muslim countries. In many countries around the world, many Muslim countries, the birth rate is exactly the same as we find in Western countries. The impact of critical scholarship on Muhammad and the Quran and Islamic history will be transmitted via the internet, and people will demand more freedom and the old regimes will crumble. But it may just be a changing of the chairs, as we've seen with the last couple of years. And unless there is a significant revival, the West will continue to lose its Christian faith, as we've seen in recent decades. But its place will be taken by the churches of the developing world. In Africa and Asia and South America, China will become a world leader politically and economically, and also in the Christian faith. The gospel is growing significantly there. And Christians from the global south will pick up the baton of the gospel, as they are already doing. We're seeing this happen already, and they'll send out missionaries who are willing to suffer and to die for their faith, and they'll do a very good job of that, taking the gospel to Muslim people. And we know how history is going to end. Jesus said, "This gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So it's the worldwide spreading of the gospel through the church, wherever that is located, that we'll see the end come. And ultimately, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So that's the Christian understanding. What about the Muslim one? Well, Muhammad made some very interesting predictions about Islam and the end times, which Muslims don't talk about very much. They present a less than optimistic view about what's going to happen. He says, Islam started as something strange, and it will again revert to its old position of being strange just as it started. And it will recede between the two mosques, that is in Mecca and Medina, as a serpent crawls back into its hole. He said, belief returns and goes back to Medina like a snake. Muslims will diminish in number and they will go back to where they started. These are not word for word, by the way. You can go and look at the originals. This is a summary of a series of hadith which talk about this. And he also had some interesting thing to say about the Muslims. He said, my generation were the best Muslims, but after 3 generations, the Muslims will be mainly treacherous and untrustworthy. They'll be the scum and the rubbish, even though their numbers may increase, and the enemy will not fear Muslims anymore. This is because the Muslims will love the world and dislike death. And there will be much killing in the last days of the Muslim. So these things, of course, may or may not be true, but according to Islamic historical records, Muhammad said them. And it's interesting to note that they are a lot less triumphalistic than the Islam will dominate claims of some of Muhammad's modern-day followers. And I think Muhammad's depiction of a shrinking and apostate Muslim community will be closer to the truth. As knowledge gets out there, people will turn from it. So how are we to respond to this as Christians in Australia? I want to give us some practical things to go away with. Well, we're followers of Jesus, and so we should look at what Jesus did. Jesus encountered a lot of the same things that we do, but he didn't respond in the same way to everyone he met. He came across 5 types of people, and his approach to them was nuanced. There were those who were trying to kill him, and he exposed them, and he said, why are you trying to kill me? He put it out publicly, what they were doing. There were those who opposed him verbally, and he answered them. Jesus never ran from a debate. He stood his ground, and he spoke his mind. Jesus also met many people in need, and he always helped them. There were some who were willing to listen to him, so he taught them, and some who wanted to follow him, and he discipled them. But he gave his life for every single one of them. Jesus saw all people and responded to them according to the ways that they responded to him. And when we encounter Muslims, we also see that there are different types of categories of Muslims. Some of them are violent and oppressive, and our calling there is to expose them. And this is the role of research and public policy, to put the history out there, to put the statements out there so people can see what they're saying and what they're doing. There are some who are critical of Christians and will try to promote Islam and denigrate the Christian faith in the public square. And our calling is to respond to them with Christian teaching and to oppose them. And that's the task of apologetics and polemics. The third group are the poor and needy Muslims. As we saw before, there's plenty of these, and our calling is to help them by showing love and compassion. And the fourth group is the responsive Muslims, those who are willing to listen to the gospel. Our calling is to teach and to train them. That's the task of evangelism and discipleship. A couple of years ago, I ran a conference here at MST, inviting people from Iran who had come to faith in Jesus. And we got over 200 of them turned up. They were meeting here. We filled up the hallway there. And others contacted me and said, look, we would love to come, but we're fearful about our family still in Iran, so we can't come. But please know that we're praying for you. And this is just a small group of one ethnic group, and it's happening across so many different nationalities. Over top of all of these things is our heart. And Brother Andrew once said, Islam stands for, I sincerely love all Muslims. So we follow the one who so loved the world that he gave his son, and so we do the same. My wife Catherine and I worked as missionaries with Interserve in several countries in Asia and the Middle East for over 20 years. And now back in Australia, we continue to have contact with Muslims and with ex-Muslims, some of whom now followers of Jesus. And several times we've had refugees from Muslim countries living with us, people who'd been escaping death threats or facing intolerable situations, people who had nowhere to stay, needed a bed, and what they got was always more than a bed, or maybe what we got was more than a bed. There were lots of forms to fill in and government offices, visits to the police, visits to psychiatric hospitals, not for us, enrolling them in courses, helping with assignments, finding jobs, writing references, finding houses, sourcing furniture, giving driving lessons. And we've been doing life together with these lovely Muslim and ex-Muslim people. Personal contact is the key. And that's appropriate because when Allah wanted to communicate with the world, he sent down a book, the Quran. When the God of the Bible wanted to show his love to the world, he came down himself. In Islam, Allah's word became print. In Christianity, God's word became flesh. And this is the call to each one of us. As the Father sent me, Jesus said, so I send you. And he calls us to become personally involved in his mission, which includes Muslims. But it will mean different things to different people according to your gifts, according to your opportunities. For some, it's a call to pray for Muslims. Some of you may go out into your neighbourhood and find some Muslims. There's about 200,000 of them here in Melbourne. 1 in 40 people is a Muslim. And ask them what they would like you to pray for them. And very rarely will you get a rejection. You could come and join us on Saturdays in the Melbourne CBD where we do outreach to Muslims and we share the gospel with them. I also do debates with Muslims, and I'm planning one of these in September with our Mission Week, and we'll also go and visit a local mosque. So there's face-to-face opportunities here. Or you could volunteer to drive a Muslim at our kamikaze driving school that we've just set up. But if you want further training, as Mark said, the Arthur Jeffries Centre has courses on all of these things. You can do it for credit or you can do it as an audit. Just pick up what you need so that you can be better equipped to do the task that God's called you to. I believe, and this is probably the most controversial thing I'll say tonight, that God has actually opened the door for Muslims to come to Australia so we can share the good news with them. And I get that from Acts 17, where Paul said to the people of the Areopagus about the nations, he said, God has determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. He did this so that people would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Catherine and I worked in several different countries, and the reason we didn't stay in one was we got expelled from a few of them because of our Christian witness. And in the last country that we lived in Yemen, over the time that we were there and in the years since, 18 of our missionary co-labourers have been killed, all of them shot dead by jihadists for sharing the gospel. But we're now back here in Australia, and God has allowed 600,000 Muslims to be here. 2/3 of them born overseas, 1/3 born here. And you can't get kicked out of Australia for sharing the gospel, at least not yet, and you're pretty unlikely to be shot. For over 100 years, 101 years, MBI, BCV, MST was established in 1920 to train people to go to the mission field overseas and to share the gospel. But now God has brought the mission field here to Melbourne. And the challenge of growing Islam is here with us. Jesus said, "Open your eyes and see, the fields are ripe for harvest." And that opportunity is for us. So brothers and sisters, let's take this opportunity while we still can. Thank you. I've got a few questions that have come up here, and people can send some more to me. Let me just see if I can find this. Okay, I'll start from the bottom and just read them out. Okay, someone said, did Islam exist before Muhammad? Sorry if I've heard it wrong. Okay, so actually there's two answers to this. Muhammad is seen as the apostle, the originator of Islam, but Muslims would say Islam is the original religion. Adam followed Islam, and so did Abraham and Moses and David and Jesus. All of these were Muslims, but over time their teachings were corrupted, and so what you have in Judaism and Christianity is a corrupted version of Islam. So they would say Islam is they call it al-fitra, the natural state for all people. And Muhammad said every child is born a Muslim, but its parents may turn it into a Christian or a Jew or a Sabaean. So there's the two answers. But really, most people would see it was Muhammad who brought along with the Quran the final revelation, and you can effectively ignore the stuff before that if you want to. Another one. Okay, so this one. How much has the state of Israel contributed to the decline of Islam in the last 75 years? Thanks, this is a really good question. So for Muslims, they actually didn't have too much problem with Israel throughout history. In Muhammad's time, there was a real problem with Jews, and so Muhammad, as we see in Medina, when he got there, there were a whole lot of tribes there. Within 5 years, all of the major tribes had either been exiled or enslaved or executed or had converted to Islam. There was no Jews that were left that were there in a free state by the time that Muhammad died, or within 5 years of Muhammad getting there. But because the Jews then lost any kind of political impact, then they were basically ignored by Muslims over time. And then in 1948, when the Jews came and established the state of Israel in what the Muslims considered to be Islamic territory of Palestine, then the Jews became very much a focus for a lot of animosity and hatred, and that has continued to this day. And so 1948 and then 1967, the Six-Day War, the Muslims were humiliated because they were defeated by a smaller army who they didn't consider to be very important. There's a saying in the Quran about the Jews, if you fight them, they will run away. And so the Muslim armies thought, we'll defeat these guys easily, and they didn't. And so that was a terrible shock for them. And so Israel has since then become a very important enemy for Israel, for the Muslim world, and a bit of a kind of a flashpoint for problems. So when something happens in Jerusalem, then Muslims all around the world will rise up. We've seen that in this last week or so. But it's interesting, we're now starting to see some Muslim countries sign pacts and treaties of non-aggression with Israel. So Egypt started, and just in the last year or so, we've seen a couple of other nations do the same thing. So that may change in the future, I'm not sure. Okay, how much of academia is discussing the validity of the existence of Muhammad? So I started my talk off by saying, well, this is the standard Muslim perspective. Academia has actually, in recent years, started to raise questions about the reality of the record. There was a book by Michael Cook and Patricia Crone a couple of decades ago, where they said, if we just look at the non-Muslim records of about Islam, we don't actually find very much. And in fact, we get the impression that Islam may not have existed, that all of this stuff that we find in the Hadith was maybe a fabrication because they were written 250, 300 years later. And maybe these things were just fables that were made up and dressed up as historical events. And so people have looked at that now, and Mark Dury has been one of the people, and Stuart Robinson, another one, talking about these things, so when we go back and look into the history, what do we find? Do we find archaeological evidence for the story of Islam? And the truth is we don't. We don't find the ancient records that we should be finding throughout Arabia of this supposedly well-developed trading route and centre. We don't find the name of Muhammad appearing in a public place for some decades after his death. This is pretty amazing for a man who had 100,000 followers. And so some are saying, well, we think that perhaps he didn't really exist as a person, or maybe someone with that name did exist, but certainly not the Muhammad Muhammad that we're finding written up in the Hadith. And that's become an important, they call it revisionist studies. And so many people are starting to raise this, both secular and Christian writers who are talking about this. So that's an area, again, I think we'll teach courses about that here at MST, don't we? Yep, so do a course on the life of Muhammad, we talk about that one. Okay, thanks for the seminar. Do you see Islam having a role in the end times, seeing that the end times, as predicted by Muhammad, mirror the biblical end times, e.g. the Islamic Mahdi resembles the Christ and Antichrist? So if you read all of Islamic eschatology, and we've got some in some of our publications where we talk about that from the Arthur Jeffrey Centre, there's quite an elaborate system that's been built up there. And you'll see a great deal of similarities between the biblical eschatology and the one that Islam, not Quran. The Quran doesn't give much detail. You typically find all of this in the Hadith, again, which was put together a couple of centuries afterwards, after Muslims had invaded and overrun Christian countries and are hearing some of their ideas. And that would be my view, that these ideas were then incorporated into Islamic eschatology. They weren't there from the original, and it's a sense of supersession, which is what one of the things that Islam does. And we see when you look at Jerusalem, there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the dome sitting on top of the site of the Jewish temple. That Islam is superseded, Islam is predominant. And I think they've done that intellectually as well, taken across Christian ideas and kind of dressed them up in Islamic dress and then passed them off as their own. So I don't necessarily see Islam as having a role in the end times. They may be one of the factors in there. The Bible doesn't give a clear indication of them. Some people would read things in the Bible and say this refers to the Muslims. I'm not as convinced about that. But certainly I think we need to deal with life as it is now rather than what it may be at the time of the end times. All right. So someone asked about David Wood of Acts 17 Apologetics. Do you know him? And if you do know him, do you agree with his apologetic approach towards Islam? Thanks. David Wood is a very controversial guy. I don't know him, but I've seen some of his stuff. And he takes a less gentle approach than I take towards Islam. He really goes in boots and all. And some people see him as, going a little bit over the top and pushing beyond the limits beyond where he should go. His scholarship, by the way, is impeccable. It is really good. He does his research. He knows his stuff. You can't fault him on that. And some people say, but I wish he was a little bit gentler. But that's the calling that he's got and the methodology, and it's very effective. Yep, all power to him. When Muslims leave Islam, do they tend to leave because they're disillusioned with it and then look for something to replace it? Or do they leave because they see Christianity or something else as a better alternative? I think it's a combination of both. So many of the people who are leaving Islam are not becoming Christians, and partly because they haven't really investigated Christianity, or they've got the sense that Christianity and the West are too closely aligned. And as we mentioned before, that doesn't bear out historically. Currently, 2/3 of the world's Christians are from Asia, Africa, the Middle East. Asia, Africa, is the third one? The Middle East, yeah. So that connection, but because they see the West as historically Christian, they think that this is the same, and they see things in the West that they don't like, and so they don't want to be connected with that. Others, and I had lunch with one yesterday, he said, when I started reading the Bible, I saw the love that comes out there, and that's what attracted me to Jesus. That's what I want to. This is the thing, he said, because he grew up in a Muslim country, he never knew anything else, but he knew that love was lacking there, and now he's found it in Jesus. So I think it's probably a combination of both of those things. Good. Where does Ishmael fit into Islam? Okay, so there's quite a story about Ishmael in the Quran. You'll know the story. So Abraham had two sons, Ishmael through his slave wife Hagar, and then Isaac through Sarah. And Muslims would say Ishmael was an Arab because he married an Egyptian wife, and they say that he came down to Mecca and he established a house there. And Abraham used to come and visit him down there. And so Ishmael is the father of the Arabs. And so Muhammad, some of his genealogies, all of them actually would trace their way back to Ishmael and say that he is their forebear. And so they have a genealogical connection with Ishmael. And they would say that because he is just as legitimate a son of Abraham as Isaac was, then Muslims have as much claim to Abraham as the Jews do and as the Christians do. And so this thing, and I think it's a fiction of the Abrahamic religions, is now being pushed out into the public arena as Jews, Christians and Muslims all come from the same kind of source theologically. And I think that's a connection that we need to address and needs to be severed. How does the principle of abrogation work in a practical matter? Can you please give an example? Okay. So abrogation is the idea that there are some verses which will cancel out some others. When you read through the Quran, sometimes you'll find it saying one thing, and then another time you'll say it's something else. And I mentioned about the 45 peaceful verses. And in fact, if you look at the Quran that you can get from the Saudi Arabian embassy, and I've got hundreds from them, down the bottom, when it has a peaceful verse, they'll have a footnote saying, this was abrogated by Surah 9:5, the verse of the sword. So Muhammad was no longer told to be peaceful once he moved to Medina. Then he was to take up the sword and to expand Islam by the use of military means. And so this was an example of abrogation. And the verse talks about that, where Allah says, if we give you a verse and we replace it with a verse which is better than it. So that kind of teaching is in there. Steve, it says, thousands of Muslims are marching, calling for the annihilation of Israel. Should we view and address this in Australia? And I think it's important to do that. And I'm interested to see the way that the government, not only the Australian government, but other governments have held this. Hamas, and I mentioned that up there as one of the terrorist organisations, because that's the classification it's given by many governments around the world, says that there is no such thing as a two-state solution. Our calling is to completely destroy the Jews. And that's why Allah has brought them here, so that they're an easier target for us to attack. That would be the kind of perspective. And we should say, look, this is abhorrent. You can't do that. When the Rohingyas were being attacked by the Burmese government, the world stood up against them and said, this is unacceptable. And any group which decides that's going to do genocide on another people, it's totally unacceptable, and we need to stand up that from a human rights perspective, let alone any kind of Christian perspective. I think that's an important response there. Okay, there are some Christians. Why are some Christians and some non-Christian Westerners converting to Islam? When I did my master's thesis, I actually interviewed 10 Anglo-Australians who had converted to Islam and said, why did you do that? So they gave me a couple of different reasons. One of them was they said, well, intellectually, Islam is a much easier religion to understand. We believe in just one God. You Christians have got this idea of the Trinity. We believe that every person should suffer for their own sin. You believe in the atonement. these ideas don't quite meld for us. Islam is much simpler, and someone made the comment, the doctrine of Islam is so simple it could be written on the back of a stamp. And that's appealing to us. The second one was, actually there was one before that, that was typically marriage. When I asked them, they'd say, well, I met a Muslim girl, I met a Muslim guy, and one of the conditions was that I convert to Islam. But these people had continued on. And just this week I heard of a man, an Australian guy who'd converted to Islam because his fiancée, a Muslim, said to him, you need to do that. So relationships was one, the simple theology was another one, and the third one was the sense of fellowship or companionship that they get. So they said Muslims are a very social, a very communal society, and when I came into that, I felt like I had a whole new set of uncles and aunties and brothers and sisters and cousins. I got invited into the community, and that was their attraction, and so they've stayed because of that. So those would typically be the three. When I asked them about their Christian faith, most of them had, if they had any idea, it was like Sunday school ideas about this, or maybe they'd picked up some of the critique from other people about Christianity. So it wasn't a sense of people who had a clear understanding of the gospel and then had decided they'd turn away from that and turn back to Islam. Or why do you think Islam being an Abrahamic religion is a fiction? It's actually only a recent idea. You don't actually come across it. Probably, Mark's there is written on this, 1950s, would that be your date? There was a... Yep. Yes, that came in through the 50s and 60s, yeah, okay. So, and it came with this sense of people wanting to solve some of those serious problems in the Middle East, of Muslims and Jews and Christians being at war with each other, and it kind of came up with the idea of, well, if we can tell them that they're all connected, then they will work harder to get on with each other. The other reason that I believe that it's a fiction, I've got an article half written on Muhammad's genealogy. And Muhammad doesn't have, most people have two genealogies, one from their mother and one from their father. Muhammad has 13 of them, and none of them line up. They'll go back to a certain point there where they agree, and then beyond that, they just go all over the place with different people that are not at all related, but they all seem to end up back to Ishmael. And that makes me a little bit suspicious that maybe they're just making this stuff up. And always they would have at the bottom there, but Allah knows the truth, which means we're not sure about this, but we'll put it down anyway. So that would be another reason for that. Theologically, of course, Islam and Christianity are really quite aiming in different directions. The beliefs that we have as Christians about the grace of God, the love of God, the atoning sacrifice, these are rejected by Islam. And so it's hard for us to say that unless, as they say, well, you've perverted and corrupted your teaching, and you should actually be more like us, which would be a claim that they would often make. All right. How good? How are the holes in the narrative debate percolating into academia? So I did my doctorate on a series of books called the Hadith, the collections of Muhammad, and in there they outline the history of how the Quran came together, and the belief is that the Quran that we have today is 100% exactly the same as the Quran that Muhammad received from the mouth of from Gabriel, and nothing has been changed over 14 centuries. And there's only ever been one Quran, and anywhere in the world you go, you look at the Quran, it will be the same. And there's one thing about this idea, and it's completely wrong, because as we lived in different Muslim countries, I would go to bookshops and say, do you have a copy of the Quran? And I could buy copies. I have a collection at home of 26, 27 different Qurans, Arabic Qurans. So it's not just one Arabic Quran. You can buy these, by the way, online from different bookshops in Lebanon and in Jordan. They're printed by Muslims, and there are varieties amongst them. And these are called the Rawayat or the Qira'at. And the reason for these things happening is a bit of a mystery to Muslims, because they believe that this book has never been changed, and yet we've got multiple copies of the book all claiming to be the same book. It doesn't make sense. And then last year, a famous Muslim scholar named Yasser Qadi, he was challenged about this, saying, well, how do we deal with this when we know we've got all these different versions of the Quran and there's only supposed to be one Quran? And he made this comment, well, there are holes in the narrative that we've received. We've been told over the centuries that this is the way that it is, but it's not true. And he said, and I don't really know the answer. And so this caused a big explosion in Muslim thinking, thinking, well, if this guy doesn't know, then who knows? This guy, by the way, has got a doctorate from Yale University. So that's a real problem there. Okay, so someone asked here, isn't Islam a polytheistic mishmash of Allah, Muhammad and Jibreel, not to mention Elat, the moon god, and whatever? Somebody obviously not impressed with the history of Islam. Certainly when you look at the Quran, you can see that there are things that have been taken from different places. You can see bits that have been borrowed clearly from Christianity. About a quarter of it is Old Testament stories, but not properly written. So you have details like Abraham gets thrown into the fiery furnace instead of Daniel's companions. Saul calls his troops together and tells them to drink the water from the river, and if they do it with their hand, he accepts them, not Gideon. So they've got the stories there, but it's mixed up. It's a little bit confused. And then you also get some elements from the Arab religions. The idea, for example, of cutting off hands for theft in chapter 5 of the Quran, that was an ancient Arab idea. The Arabs were doing that before Islam came along. It's nothing new. And you can actually trace a whole lot of these things. There's borrowings from a whole lot of different languages. The name of the ladies in paradise, they're called huris. That's a Persian word. So these ideas have been picked up and carried across and put into the Quran. So it's not a pure idea that has been put together in a kind of from a single source at all. Why are some sections of the left aligning with Islam? I've talked with some of the Muslims and asked them why they're aligning with the left. And one of them, a guy with a long beard, who I knew was from the kind of the radical end of Islam, he said, we'll walk with these people as long as it's convenient with us. And I think that's what the left is doing as well. There's so many things that in the teaching of Islam that they would disagree with, the kind of the left would typically have strong views about feminism and a whole lot of other perspectives. So they're kind of putting those aside, but their goal is basically to try and grab a position of preeminence, and then when they do that, then they can dispose of their competitors, and I think that's going to happen. Anyway, I see Daniel is moving, I see Dennis is moving up on me. Does that mean it's time for me to finish? One more question, all right. Sorry, I can keep talking all night. Let me see if there is one more. I thought I saw one that came up here. Where was that? Oh. Okay. Yep. No, that's it. That's all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernie. This was a great lecture. So thank you very much for coming here in person today, and thank you very much for those who joined us online. And if you have time, please feel free to stay longer. There is tea, coffee available in the foyer. And there are some of the Bernie's books out there that are available for purchase. So stay longer. It would be great to chat with you all. Thank you very much.